Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for being here with us today. This is very exciting. I don't know almost everyone on the Zoom, so welcome and thanks for joining us to talk about Beyond Plastic Bottles and Onto Your Plate, an intro to DefaultVeg and some strategies that you can implement in your work. So good morning. Hello. My name is Steph. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a consultant with the Better Food Foundation. That is a nonprofit responsible for DefaultVeg campaign, which we will be talking about today. And I'm going to start by kicking it off with my co-host, Sam from Green Spark Group. Sam.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sam from Green Spark Group. I'm a sustainability consultant working with film, TV, and advertising on how to make their production practices more sustainable, lower emissions. And it's a great world to be in. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So we're just going to start off by talking about the climate impacts of food as well as the industry at large. Next slide. Perfect. So recently, in past years, scientists have started sounding alarm bells about the carbon footprint of the global food system. Several studies published in peer-reviewed journals and by internationally reputable organizations have found that we cannot keep climate change under control if those of us in high-consuming economies continue our diets as they are currently. Even if every other sector, energy, transportation, buildings, became completely carbon neutral by 2050, the food system alone could take us past 1.5 degrees of warming. So we're talking about food today because of this significant contribution to climate change. Food production causes about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and producing animal products emits 58% of all emissions from food. Further, beef and lamb products alone account for 50% of emissions from those animal products. This graph shows the relative emissions of protein-rich animal and plant foods per kilogram of product based on global averages. You can clearly see the scale of difference between beef at the very top and other categories. But even poultry, which you can see sort of middle towards the bottom, one of the lower emitting meat products, is 11 times more emissions intensive than lentils, which are at the very bottom. Other pulses and nuts, sorry, which are at the very bottom. Animal agriculture uses 77% of all global farmland and produces 57% of all food-related greenhouse gas emissions, But it only produces 37% of the world's protein. So plants produce most of the protein, while animals produce most of the emissions. In addition to emissions, there are also our finite resources, such as land and water, to consider. For example, the Colorado River is a lifeline to 7 states, including California. The river is diverted throughout the watershed to provide water to residences and businesses, but about 70% of that water is used for growing alfalfa for animal feed. Water rights along the river are complicated social issues, but this disparity between water use highlights yet another area where reducing meat consumption can improve our global resource use and impacts. Here are some other fun facts about how adopting a plant-based diet can improve biodiversity, as well as food security at a global level. And you'll hear much more about this from Steph later. Research in this area is continuing, but reducing meat consumption, especially in top consuming nations, is generally projected to have positive environmental impacts around the world. So what does this have to do with the screen industries? As a consultant, I regularly speak with producers, coordinators, departments, people on the ground, vendors about production carbon footprints and the opportunities that we all have to reduce these emissions. We tend to focus on the highest impact categories when prioritizing budgets and best practices. So let's look at some production industry data to get a sense of what this means and how food fits into the conversation. So I don't know if everybody here has already seen this report, but take a look at this average carbon footprint from a tentpole film. This seminal report from the UK on screen industry impact shows us the primary emission sources from a very, very large tentpole production. Primarily, the film industry has focused on the high priority categories of fuel, utilities, air travel, and accommodations to align with corporate sustainability reporting requirements. However, what's missing from these footprints are generally things like food, set materials, and waste disposal, which are an additional level of emissions to consider. As reporting requirements and capabilities continue to expand, these impacts are starting to be tracked and reported. So let's think things through. How does diet impact a production's emissions? So this is another groundbreaking industry report from 2021 by the Sustainable Production Alliance of major US studios. You can see the same categories of utilities, fuel, accommodation, and air travel shown for an average episode this time of 4 different TV formats. So let's see what happens when we add food to this footprint. Amazing. So we made some assumptions about crew sizes and shoot days per episode in order to get a rough estimate of what the additional impacts of food would be from a standard menu. And the results here are pretty noteworthy. As you can see, by adding food emissions to the production format, we can see that especially for the larger drama productions, which have more crew members, therefore more meals, bigger menus, food could contribute up to 17% of emissions to a production footprint. And we even see somewhere around 10 to 15% for the other sizes. So here's another example. This is from a much smaller production that I've worked on recently. It was a commercial, just a single day shoot working with a very small crew. And the bar chart in orange shows you the emissions in terms of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by the type of meal. So you can see the types of meal along the bottom, which are beef, chicken, seafood, vegetarian, and vegan. The line chart at the top in gray shows you the number of meals that were purchased by catering for that production. I used Albert's sister tool, which is called AdGreen, in order to calculate these emissions. You can clearly see that the impacts of a beef meal, of which there were only 14, are much higher in terms of emissions compared to chicken, especially vegetarian and vegan options, even though there were more meals served of those types. So we have a little bit of a quiz for the group to see what you are paying attention to. So let's think this through a little bit. If you have a small team, maybe the limited time, tight budget, what are some of the top choices that you can make to reduce emissions? So on the screen, you'll see a series of actions that we typically recommend to our clients that we work with. Now, a poll should have just shown up for you, and I would like you to vote on what you think would be the most sustainable action out of that list. So we'll give you a few seconds to vote, and then we'll show the answers on the screen. All right, I think the votes are all coming in. Okay, let's see the answers. Okay, so I hope many of you learned something from that. So I'm about to show you some results based on these particular answers, but I did want to say here that really the point of this exercise is to think through the creative options for us to reduce our emissions in a variety of ways. People tend to focus on things like recycling, eliminating plastic water bottles, and while these are really, really important to do, they alone are just a drop in the bucket compared to other sustainable actions that contribute to emissions. So let's look at the next slide and see the results here. So again, we made some assumptions based on average production statistics, and this one was particularly for a crew of 100 filming over 4 months. So individual actions really do matter. An individual person on that production, if they chose to drive an EV to work with their regular commute, instead of driving a regular internal combustion engine vehicle, that would have the most absolute emissions reductions out of the choices on the list. But many people are surprised to see that eliminating meat and dairy from your diet actually has a major impact on reducing personal emissions, especially compared to other options that we typically think about, like we're using water bottles, composting food, and using 100% recycled content paper. Now, this example is just demonstrative for us to just start to think about what these different actions mean. And as I see in the chat coming in, there are so many other ways that we can also reduce our emissions here. But I wanted to demonstrate really that difference between or really the major impact that eliminating meat and dairy from your diet can have. And remember this chart because Steph is going to refer to it later in the presentation. But now I'd like to pass it back so we can learn more about DefaultVeg.
Thanks, Sam. I feel like we tricked you all a little bit there with the poll, but it's still a really important thing, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So, okay, so now you've heard all about the environmental impacts of how plant-based diets can help, and you're probably wondering, what the heck is this thing that we keep talking about called DefaultVeg? Well, I'm going to share with you what exactly DefaultVeg is, and then I'm going to share with you a couple tips and tricks of how to implement it in your work. And I will also pitch, I'll mention it again later, but we are doing a caterer webinar in March. If there are any caterers that you work with that might want more detailed, in-depth tips and tricks of how to implement DefaultVeg in their work. Okay, so DefaultVeg is based on this concept of nudges or defaults that was popularized by this book Nudge a few years ago. Defaults are the option that people end up with if they do not make an active choice. So when you think about this in your daily life, it's like your default phone or your default email settings, right? Those are the settings that are going to be there unless if you do something to change them. And what's cool about defaults is that there's a lot of human behavioral science that shows that people tend to stick with the default option. It's seen as the norm and we want to fit in, or because frankly, we're pretty lazy people and it's a lot more work to change it. And this is like one less choice that you have to do in your daily lives, okay? So the classic example of the power of defaults is in organ donation. So you can see in Germany, where people by default are not organ donors, they have to opt in to be organ donors. About 12% of the population are organ donors. Whereas in Austria, which is a neighbor of Germany, the opposite is true. By default, everyone is an organ donor, so you have to opt out of being an organ donor. And about 99 to 100% of their population are organ donors. You can see on this chart, everything on the left in red are opt-in organ donations, and everything on the right in green are opt-out organ donations, okay? So when we apply this to food, you get the concept of DefaultVeg, which is the campaign that I help run. So DefaultVeg is a simple and inclusive strategy that makes plant-based foods the default while giving people the choice to opt into meat and dairy. The last part of the sentence is really, really important because I feel like that's the number one pushback that we always get on sets is the grips want their meat, right? Well, I'm not coming for your meat. I think it's really important that people have the complete freedom of choice in their diets. But what we're asking people to do here is make sustainability the default through plant-based foods. So it's an incredibly effective strategy. This is a study that was done in 3 conferences in Denmark. You can see on average when meat was the default and people could request a vegetarian option, 94% of people stuck with the meat and only 6% request a vegetarian. But when you flip it, you make vegetarian the default, 87% of people stuck with the veg option and 13% opted into meat, which is about an 80 percentage point increase. At Better Food Foundation, we've done some studies like this ourselves, particularly on college campuses. And we tend to work with a 60 percentage point increase. So when you see any of our calculations in the future, that's generally the number that we're going to be working with. Okay. This is also important from an inclusion standpoint. So 30 to 50 million Americans are lactose intolerant. There are a lot of religions that restrict certain animal products. Black Americans are actually more than twice as likely to be vegan as white Americans. And plant-based populations plant-based diets are on the rise in younger populations especially, but also a quarter of Americans report eating less meat every single year. Okay, so in the film world, in the TV world, the entertainment industry, you can implement this everywhere. And February is not too late to start making some resolutions about incorporating your plant-based diets. So you could do this on set. We have a couple of movies that we're working with to implement this on their sets. If you have in-office lunches or you have meal ordering, group ordering, you can use it on your order sheets. If you have one-off events, these are really easy strategies to implement for your office parties or fundraisers. If you have any special events, if you're doing wrap parties or you have catered dinners, or if you're part of an awards show, this is really easy to implement. If you are part of a studio and you have a cafeteria, we're working with a couple of studios right now to flip their cafeterias. And then, you know, everyone these days is talking about content creation and climate content, and it doesn't stop with food either. what you show on your dinner table really does matter. So opt for some plant-based diets instead of your meatloaf dinner on the table. And then we're finding we have a lot of influence and a lot of success so far is if you have any internal sustainability metrics guides, or if you're a producer and you work with a greening organization, we recommend scrapping the Meatless Monday conversations. A lot of people are relying on that, and DefaultVeg ends up having a much larger impact. And the phrase we recommend people taking up is offer catering with plant-based foods by default with the choice to opt into meat and dairy. So I'm going to quickly return to that slide that Sam showed you earlier about your personal emissions reduction. And you can see, while it's not as impactful as eliminating meat and dairy, of course, it's still a huge way to reduce your personal emissions. And I did do the math here. So if DefaultVeg was implemented on a 4-month movie with a crew of 100 people, it would save up to 20.9 metric tons of CO2 emissions, which is the equivalent of 74,000 miles being driven. And then my personal favorite is up to 1.4 million liters of water, which is the equivalent of 22,000 showers. That's just from one movie production. Okay, so hopefully by now we've sold you that this is a really important idea and something that you guys can do. But you're probably having a disconnect of, how do I do this, right? Like, this sounds great in theory, but how do we implement this? So I'm going to give you 5 tips and tricks today that you can implement in any food service setting. And like I said, there's a lot more intensive conversations we can have. We will have a Q&A at the end. If you have specific questions about anything, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A function. But for right now, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the 5 ways that you can implement DefaultVeg in your work. Okay, so number 1 is to make it plant-based, like we've been talking about. So default to plant-based with the option to add in meat or dairy. So instead of a chicken pasta pesto or chicken pesto pasta, right? Call it a fresh spring greens pasta with pesto and lemon, and add chicken and Parmesan in the end, okay? This can be implemented in any sort of food service setting. So if people are RSVPing for an event, use the opt-in defaults that we talked about earlier, right? So opt in for meat and dairy, but plant-based by default. If food is being served on a buffet, pull all the meat and dairy out of your main entrees and put them at the end of your line as a garnish or a topping. Always put your plant-based items at the very front of your buffet. People are more likely to fill up their plates than with more of the plant-based items, and then use meat and dairy as a garnish at the end. And then finally, if it's a set menu or ordering at a restaurant kind of a thing, we see this all the time where people have bowls or they have salads, right? And the base of it is plant-based, and then you can add on meat or dairy for an additional charge. So this is a quick case study. We worked with the New York City Health and Hospital System to flip 11 of the public hospitals in New York City, and they are using a plant-based default strategy. And the 2 points I want to make here are that we have a 95% satisfaction rate with the food. And also they're saving 59 cents per plate, which is going to be about $500,000 per year for the New York City hospital system. Okay, tip number 2 is have climate-friendly ratios. So when it's not possible for the entire base meal to be plant-based, create the perception that plant-based is the default by offering more and abundant options of vegan to meat options, right? So a minimum of 2 to 1 plant-based to animal options. If there's only one option on the table or only one option on the menu, it stands out and it makes the perception that like that is only for vegans and vegetarians, instead of it's a normal thing that everyone can have. And when there's a multitude of veg dishes, then they seem like they're normal and everyone can choose from them. And this is actually based in science as well. When 3/4 options of the options are meat-based, only 12% of people will choose the veg option. But when the opposite's true and you have an abundance of veg options, almost half the amount of people will choose that. We did this at LinkedIn San Francisco office. They just increased the amount of plant-based offerings that they had, and they ended up serving half as much meat, which reduced their carbon footprint by 65%. Okay, number 3 is menu merger, which means to incorporate the plant-based options into the menu And always, again, still having plant-based as the first option. Again, this is the same idea. When you have vegan or vegetarian options segregated into their own section, omnivores think it's not for them. They think it's just for vegans. And this is actually also, again, based in science. So the World Resource Institute Better Buying Lab found that when you integrate plant-based menu items throughout your menu, it increases selection of plant-based items by 56%. Tip number 4 is use mouthwatering labels. We recommend using the words plant forward or plant-based. People really don't like the word vegan or healthy these days. But more than that, focus on your flavor, the texture, where it's from, or the ingredients that exist in the item you're offering. So this is a real world example. This is a software company that we worked with. They called it a vegetarian hummus wrap. And they changed the title of the sandwich to delicious roast red pepper, avocado, and hummus wrap. And that single action alone increased sales a lot. One of the great ways to think about this is like if you saw a celiac bowl on a menu, if you didn't have celiac disease or you aren't gluten-free, you probably wouldn't order it. But if it was called a Thai peanut rice noodle bowl, you might actually want to order it, right? So the same is true for plant-based diets as well. Okay, the 5th and final tip I can give you today is to make subtle substitutions. So especially when you think about plant-based condiments, milks, desserts, or breads, anything that's like on the side of anything, make it plant-based by default. This often means it'll be more inclusive. Nowadays, products are so good that people don't even notice the difference. I am a cook. I wouldn't call myself a chef, but I'm a cook. And I challenge you to do a blind taste test. I just did one with butter recently, and I made the commitment to only purchase vegan butter going forward. And often it's cheaper, it's inexpensive, as we saw in the case of the New York City hospital system, especially if you're not using meat replacement, but instead replacing some of your beef with mushrooms for a more umami flavor, you're going to reduce the cost of your overall goods. The best example of this, we work with a lot of coffee bars and coffee shops to do an oat milk default, which is substituting oat milk as the default, and then people can opt in for dairy milk. And we've seen it very successful at a bunch of places. Blue Bottles initiative was really successful, and they expanded it to all their stores nationwide. So if you join and adopt any of these strategies, you will be joining an awesome group of people. We have a lot of representation in colleges, we have conferences, we have nonprofits, for-profits. We have a couple of cities that have adopted DefaultVeg as their strategies. And then in the entertainment industry, we've been so honored and lucky to have Green the Bid and the Directors Guild of America sustainability recommendations. They both include DefaultVeg language in their sustainability recommendations. And then the Green Production Group is also very supportive of this as well. So, okay, so I'm going to roll into the Q&A here. We're going to do this pretty informally, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. I do just want to put up our contact info so you all have it. That's my email. Feel free to reach out to me for anything. I will mention also that the Better Food Foundation is a nonprofit advocacy organization, so we really are not charging for our services. We just want people to adopt and embrace our policies. So if there's anything that we can do to support you and help you with that, we would love to do that. I'm also going to plug the caterer webinar, which is happening on March 18th. If you have any caterers that you work with that you think might be interested in doing this, but don't quite have the resources or the know-how yet to be able to do that, I would love to have them come. I will send out more information about that as well. Sam, do you want to say anything?
Well, just my email is also there. Feel free to reach out. We work with everybody throughout the film and TV and advertising industries. So I would love to get in touch with you and chat about some sustainability options. We do training courses, we do consulting, and we're very passionate about what we do. So I'd love to hear from you.
So I'm just gonna look through the chat and see if there are any questions. I saw one come in through the Q&A that says, do you have a list or database of production caterers who ascribe to this? That's an excellent question. I do not. I have a couple recommendations of caterers, but it is something we're working with for any of the greening guides like Green the Bid or Green Production Group to be able to have some sort of a phrase that says default veg approved or something like that. But I would love to, as we get more adoptees, be able to build that network out and share that information.
And I'll just say too, if you're looking for lists in general of anything related to sustainable production, the Green Production Guide has a green vendor database that you can search. They've got caterers, craft services, many other options there. And I think the link was just shared in the chat 2 times. So definitely check that out for a list. And if you work with a vendor who, you know, provides sustainable services and you don't find them there, definitely submit them to be added. Or if you're a vendor yourself, also submit them to be added.
Okay, I'm seeing one question. Do you guys have a one sheet or something who may not feel they have a lot of sway and yet can be very impactable? Say a production coordinator or someone to share up the chain. Something quick and easy to digest, but impacting. Yeah, thanks for that question, Becca. Yes, I will follow up with everyone who registered for this event with the slides and with the recording of this. And also we do have a one-pager that explains specifically in film production how to do default veg. So I will follow up with that. Thank you.
We also have several resources about best practices and the relative impacts just to help think through like what this choice is going to do to reduce our emissions and reduce our impact. So I will send those to Steph to distribute as well.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other further questions?
Hello, this is the behind the scenes moderator. I do have a couple I saved from the chat so you all don't have to
Thanks,
scroll up.
Gloria.
So a couple of people asked about if it's possible to compare these benefits with, we know you did the EV vehicles. They were wondering about taking public transport, carpooling, or taking the bus or biking, and whether you can do any calculations to kind of compare the impacts with those.
How about Steph, just to put on the screen, why don't you go back to the second chart that
Sure.
we had?
No, I don't remember which slide it is.
While you're pulling that up, I'll just say that we pulled those together out of some standard practices that we see, especially based in LA, where a lot of people are driving their cars to and from work, sometimes sitting in traffic longer than you'd prefer to. So the short answer is absolutely yes. You can definitely show emissions reductions for biking and taking transit. We used a tool you can see in the bottom called the Albert Carbon Calculator to estimate these impacts here. So if that's something that you have access to, there are also several resources online through the US EPA that can tell you your relative emissions reductions. They have nice little fact sheets and myth busting pages that can help you understand where those reductions can be most impactful here too. So the driving an EV is just one example. It is certainly not the only way to reduce your emissions from transport. And obviously, if you're not burning any fossil fuels, you're just using your muscles to pedal a bicycle, then those emissions are pretty well down to zero. I don't think we have to count the carbon dioxide that you breathe out here. That might be a bit too fine detailed. So yes, certainly many other ways to reduce emissions from transportation.
Laura, did we have any other questions that came in?
I think that's about it. We had a couple in the Q&A that we answered, so you all should be able to view those answers if you open the Q&A.
I also just saw a great message come up in the chat from Michael about encouraging carpooling in particular on set. It's best to do this by department because they'll usually have similar call and wrap times. And that's certainly a great thing to distribute to your teams as you're working on them.
Yeah, I see a question. I'm going to read it as I'm answering it from Carly. The default method would only work if food choices are made up front to the shoot. How do caterers eliminate the waste? Our policy is no red meat on our shoots, but we do offer chicken or fish lunch if it's a cold day in the UK, a chicken sausage at breakfast. We upfront share this with crew before we engage with them, but you have me thinking now how to switch it up. Yeah, Carly, that's great. Every little bit helps of eliminating meat and dairy on set. And yeah, I would love to talk to you further about if you have caterers or any questions specifically about how you set everything up. I love the idea of also bringing crew in as part of this initiative. We have a lot of sheets that, say today we're going meatless and here's why, that have stats and thoughts about how to engage crew in that way. But also one of the beauties of the idea of around the defaults is that most of the people don't even realize you're changing anything. It's just about how you present the food or how you source the food or how you plan your menus that actually makes reduction of meat and dairy very easy to do. So please reach out if you have any questions. I'd love to talk to you one-on-one. Okay, I see Michael says proper portioning, food donation of edible excess and compost systems are key. Absolutely. We definitely need composting on sets as well. And then one more question. I wonder if BFF or Green Spark would host a Zoom roundtable or other forum for all of us production types to swap stuff we've tried, challenges we've run into, etc. Kick that to Sam.
Yeah. So I'd love to get in touch. So definitely reach out. We could certainly chat about what a format like that could look like. Green Spark Group, we do work with several other organizations across North America on these types of roundtable discussions. Our sister nonprofit organization is called the Sustainable Production Forum. Or actually, they're called the Sustainable Entertainment Society, and they run the Sustainable Production Forum every year. So that is one organization that is, it's nonprofit. It's a group of people who are passionate, just like the folks here. And if you want to reach out to me, I can connect you with the organizers of that event. And we can talk about having an industry roundtable that would span jurisdictions in that way. So certainly we love having conversations about this.
I will also plug Green Spark Group does a really awesome training. If you all have not taken it, it's very, very cool. It's open, anyone can go. Yeah.
Yeah. It's usually run out of Canadian organizations that we work with. And so if you have questions, definitely reach out.
We got another question in the chat about handouts that you can print and pass around at events. Absolutely. I have a couple handouts. We're working on making more. I will be sure to pass them around to anyone who attended the webinar. But if anyone needs anything, if you need stats or data or you want something specifically made, I am happy to create it for you. Just reach out. All right. Well, it seems like we're winding down. I will put up our contact information again, just so everyone has it. And stay on for a moment longer if anyone has any other questions, but so appreciative of you all being here. Thank you for making sustainable choices in your productions and on your sets. And thanks for hanging out with us for half an hour today. Appreciate it. Hope you all have a really great Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.